3 times in the history of spaceflight, a rocket has been struck by lightning while climbing away from Earth. Once, it nearly ended in the loss of 3 astronauts on their way to the moon. Once, it destroyed the entire vehicle in seconds. And once, just days ago, it happened again, caught clearly on camera, and the rocket simply kept flying like nothing had touched it at all. Let's start with what just happened, because it's the freshest chapter in this story. On Thursday, July 23, 2026, a Long March 3B rocket lifted off from China's Xichang Satellite Launch Center, carrying the Tianlian 206 communications relay satellite toward geostationary orbit. Around 30 seconds into flight, still climbing through thick, electrically charged cloud cover, lightning struck the vehicle directly. Photographer Zhou Quan captured the exact moment on camera, and crowds watching from the ground gasped as the bolt connected with the lower section of the rocket. Despite the strike, the Long March 3B continued its ascent without interruption. And according to the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, the satellite reached its planned orbit exactly as intended. The mission was declared a complete success. Here's the part of this story that almost never gets the attention it deserves. And it's the reason this single event is worth placing inside a much longer historical timeline. This wasn't the first time a rocket has been struck by lightning during launch, and it wasn't even the second. It's part of a small, specific pattern stretching back more than half a century, one that includes a near disaster involving American astronauts, a catastrophic total failure that changed aerospace engineering forever, and now this. Understanding all 3 side by side tells you almost everything you need to know about how launch safety actually evolved into what it is today. I'm the host here at Today Latest Analysis, and every detail in this documentary comes from verified historical records and official statements, not exaggerated for effect. Subscribe now, because we cover real space history exactly like this, connecting today's headlines to the events that shaped them. Let's start at the beginning of this timeline, because the first entry is also one of the most famous close calls in the entire history of human spaceflight. November 14th, 1969. NASA's Apollo 12 mission, the second crewed mission ever to attempt a landing on the moon, lifted off from Kennedy Space Center carrying astronauts Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon. The weather that day included low clouds, and less than a minute after liftoff, the Saturn V rocket carrying the crew was struck by lightning. Then, just seconds later, it was struck again. Inside the command module, warning lights lit up across the instrument panel as multiple onboard systems briefly malfunctioned, including a temporary loss of telemetry data being transmitted back to mission control on the ground. For a tense stretch of seconds, engineers on the ground and the crew inside the spacecraft worked through confusing, cascading system failures without immediately knowing exactly what had caused them, or how serious the underlying damage might be. A flight controller identified the fuel cell system as the likely source of the problem, and the crew was instructed to switch the affected systems to a backup configuration. That single call worked. Power was restored, telemetry came back online, and Apollo 12 continued its climb into orbit, ultimately going on to complete a fully successful lunar landing days later. It remains one of the clearest examples in spaceflight history of a crew and mission control diagnosing and recovering from a serious in-flight electrical failure in real time, under the kind of pressure most people will never have to experience, even once in their lives. It's worth understanding the specific mechanism behind what happened to Apollo 12, because the Saturn V wasn't simply an unlucky bystander, struck by an ordinary bolt of lightning that would have happened regardless. Much like the rocket-triggered lightning explanation offered for the 2026 Long March 3B incident, investigators later concluded that the Saturn V's exhaust plume, a long, hot, electrically conductive column of ionized gas trailing behind the vehicle, likely created a conductive path connecting the charged clouds above to the ground below, essentially completing a circuit that triggered the discharge. In other words, the rocket may not have simply flown into a bolt that was going to strike regardless of its presence. Its own exhaust may have reached upward into an electrically charged cloud layer and effectively invited the strike to happen, a phenomenon engineers now specifically account for when setting launch weather restrictions, rather than treating it as pure environmental bad luck. That event alone might have been remembered as a strange, isolated piece of space history, a dramatic story with a happy ending. It didn't stay isolated for long. March 26, 1987, a United States Atlas-Centaur rocket, designated Flight 67, launched from Cape Canaveral carrying a Navy communication satellite. Roughly 48 seconds after liftoff, in conditions involving clouds capable of carrying an electrical charge, the rocket triggered a lightning strike, similar in basic mechanism to what had happened to Apollo 12 nearly 2 decades earlier. But this time, there was no successful backup switch, no recovered telemetry, no happy ending. The electrical surge from the strike traveled directly into wiring connected to the rocket's digital flight control computer. That computer, suddenly fed corrupted electrical signals, issued a hard, incorrect steering command. The rocket violently pitched off its intended flight path. Aerodynamic stress immediately exceeded what the vehicle's structure could survive, and it broke apart in the sky, destroying both the rocket and the satellite it was carrying. The specific chain of failure here is worth walking through in a bit more detail because it explains exactly why this single incident carried so much weight in reshaping aerospace safety standards going forward. The lightning strike itself didn't physically destroy the rocket. It corrupted data. The electrical surge traveled into the rocket's guidance system wiring and altered the digital signal the flight computer was reading, essentially feeding it false information about the vehicle's actual orientation and trajectory. Believing this corrupted data, the computer responded exactly as it was designed to when it detects a genuine flight path deviation. It issued a hard correction, a steering command based entirely on inaccurate information. That single automated decision, technically correct given the data the computer believed it was seeing, was enough to tear the vehicle apart in the sky. It's a sobering illustration of how a purely electrical disturbance, without a single piece of the rocket's physical structure being directly damaged by the strike itself, can still result in total vehicle loss purely through corrupted guidance data. Unlike Apollo 12, where human astronauts and ground controllers were able to intervene and correct course, Atlas-Centaur 67 was an uncrewed vehicle relying entirely on automated systems that, in this specific case, had no adequate protection against exactly the kind of electrical disturbance a lightning strike produces. The aftermath of that failure fundamentally changed how the entire aerospace industry approaches launch weather safety. And it's worth understanding exactly what changed, because it's precisely why the story of lightning-struck rockets doesn't end there. In the direct aftermath of the Atlas-Centaur 67 failure, NASA developed a formal set of rules known as the Lightning Launch Commit Criteria, a detailed checklist of atmospheric and weather conditions that must all be satisfied before any rocket is cleared to launch. Now, these criteria go well beyond simply checking whether lightning is actively visible near the launch pad. They include specific rules about cloud types, cloud thickness, the distance from any thunderstorm activity, and direct measurements of the electric field strength in the atmosphere along the planned flight path since, as the Atlas-Centaur 67 disaster proved, a rocket doesn't necessarily need visible lightning already occurring nearby to trigger a strike. It can, under the right electrical conditions, generate that strike itself simply by flying through a sufficiently charged cloud. According to NASA's own technical documentation, since the Atlas-Centaur 67 failure and the rigorous implementation of these criteria, no other American launch vehicle has intercepted or triggered lightning during a flight, a streak stretching across nearly 4 decades of successful prevention, built entirely on the hard lesson learned from that single catastrophic failure. That brings the story to its third chapter, the one that just happened. The July 2026 Long March 3B strike shares clear similarities with both previous incidents, a rocket climbing through charged cloud cover and electrical discharge connecting with the vehicle's structure roughly half a minute into flight. But the outcome landed much closer to Apollo 12's survival than to Atlas-Centaur 67's total loss, and understanding why requires looking at how launch vehicle engineering has continued advancing in the decades since both of those earlier incidents. Modern rockets, including the Long March 3B, are specifically engineered with the assumption that a lightning strike, or a rocket-triggered discharge, remains a real, if rare, possibility despite pre-launch weather screening. Much of the electrical current from a strike is designed to travel harmlessly along the rocket's conductive outer skin, essentially treating the entire vehicle exterior as a controlled path to redirect that energy safely around rather than through the sensitive electronics inside. Layered on top of that conductive pathway, internal shielding and overvoltage protection specifically guard flight computers, guidance systems, and payload electronics from any surge that manages to penetrate past the outer shell. That combination is almost certainly why the Long March 3B was able to absorb a direct strike and continue its ascent exactly as planned, delivering the Tianlian-2 Zero-6 satellite to orbit without any acknowledged disruption to the mission at all. There's a fourth, less widely publicized incident worth adding to this timeline too, a 2019 Soyuz 2 launch from Russia's Plesetsk Cosmodrome, carrying a GLONASS-M navigation satellite, which was also struck by lightning shortly after liftoff, and, much like the Long March 3B 7 years later, continued on to complete its mission successfully. Depending on how strictly you count documented, verified incidents, this newest event represents either the third or the fourth confirmed case of a rocket being struck by lightning during an active launch, but the underlying pattern holds regardless of the exact count. 2 crewed or uncrewed missions survived their strikes through a combination of engineering and, in Apollo 12's case, real-time human intervention. One did not survive at all, and that single catastrophic failure is directly responsible for the strict weather safety criteria that every major spacefaring nation now follows before clearing a rocket for launch. So here's what this timeline actually teaches us, laid out side by side rather than as 3 disconnected news stories. Apollo 12 showed that even a direct, repeated lightning strike doesn't have to be fatal to a mission if backup systems exist, and the people operating them can diagnose the problem fast enough. Atlas-Centaur 67 showed exactly what happens when those protections aren't sufficient. An uncrewed rocket with inadequate electrical shielding fed a corrupted signal and torn apart in seconds. And that failure directly produced the modern weather criteria and layered electrical protections now built into rockets like the Long March 3B, protections that were tested for real on camera in front of a watching crowd just days ago and passed the test completely. It's worth being direct about something important here too. None of this means lightning strikes are now a fully solved zero-risk problem. Pre-launch weather screening, using the Lightning Launch Commit criteria and equivalent standards used by other space agencies, significantly reduces the odds of a rocket ever encountering a strike in the first place. But, as this most recent event demonstrates, it doesn't reduce that risk to absolute zero, since atmospheric conditions can shift, or a rocket's own conductive body can interact with a marginally charged cloud in ways that aren't always fully predictable in advance. What has changed dramatically since 1987 is what happens next if a strike does occur. The difference between a mission ending in catastrophic failure and a mission continuing on to deliver its payload exactly as planned now comes down almost entirely to the quality of the engineering built into the vehicle from the very beginning: conductive pathways, layered shielding, and redundant systems specifically designed around surviving the exact scenario Atlas-Centaur 67 could not. 3 documented strikes, separated by more than 50 years, tell a genuinely complete story about how an entire industry learned to survive one of nature's most sudden and violent phenomena. Apollo 12 proved survival was possible. Atlas-Centaur 67 proved exactly what happens without the right protections in place. And the Long March 3B, just days ago, proved how far that engineering has come since, absorbing a direct hit 30 seconds after leaving the ground and simply continuing on toward orbit, as though the sky itself had barely touched it. I'll bring you the next update if any further verified lightning strike incidents come to light, or if additional technical details emerge about exactly how the Long March 3B's systems handled this most recent strike. If you want real space history explained clearly, connecting today's headlines to the events that actually shaped modern engineering standards, that's exactly what we do here every time a story like this breaks. Drop a comment and let me know which of these 3 incidents surprised you most: Apollo 12's narrow escape, Atlas-Centaur 67's total loss, or the fact that this exact scenario just played out again on camera days ago. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update. Share this with anyone who'd find real aerospace history genuinely fascinating. And I'll see you in the next one.